Jerry began his career as a surveying instructor in 1979 and retiring for the second time in 2020. Jerry taught at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, Purdue University, Penn State, Wilkes-Barre, and Madison Area Technical College, and has presented workshops and seminars since 1984. Jerry has also worked with the NGS, the BLM, Wisconsin DOT, and the Wisconsin Department of Regulation and Licensing, and has done some consulting work as well. Although retired, Jerry still occasionally presents seminars and devotes a lot of time to Mentoring Mondays, which we truly appreciate, and still serves on a few Wisconsin land surveyors committees. So as we talked about, a fun, interesting topic, which, like we said, there's only 20 of us on here, and I'm curious to see how the reviews go, but we definitely appreciate the you taking the time and presenting on ethics tonight. So
sure. I'm looking at a third time for retirement now, by the way. I've started. So there's my contact information on there for those of you that are interested. I have a tendency to take a slightly different tack to ethics, as you'll see as we go through this. If you've had a chance to go to the website and download the paper and look at the case studies, the way I approach ethics is, rather than try to teach people what ethics is, usually what we do is we break down into small teams after I do a quick and dirty presentation, and then we have them discuss situations to see if there are in fact ethical dilemmas, and if there are, how to resolve them, or can they be resolved, and that type of thing. And I like to kind of kick it off with a couple of things that I found over the years with respect to ethics and cartoons and that type of thing. But my favorite is, I found this ad on onlinewritingjobs.com, and if you look at it, it says, looking for a writer to write a 2 essay paper 7 to 10 pages long for a college ethics class. Now you think about that. This is somebody looking to hire someone else to write an ethics paper for them. You know, it's kind of like a poetic justice and that type of thing. But they are so persnickety on this that they're asking you to send in details of your experience of writing a college paper and your grades for them. So they also have high standards for when they're doing participating in unethical practices and that type of thing. I always thought that was quite an interesting thing.
You know, Jerry, at least they're doing qualifications-based selection there.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean,
not low bid.
If you're going to do it, you might as well do it right. It's like, you know, I used to tell my students, if anybody ever accuses you of unethical behavior, you stop, you thank them, because they evidently think enough of you in the first place and think you have ethics to begin with. So awesome. Anyway, so and the other thing I like to start out with is a famous quote, paraphrasing Chief Justice Stewart, or Justice Stewart, from a case back in 1964 dealing with a pornography case and movies and that type of thing. And I have the full quote in my paper, which I don't have here with me. But basically what it boils down to, in the way it's been paraphrased, is, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And when we look at it, ethics is kind of the same way too. It's one of those things where we know what it is. It's hard to describe, you know, to kind of come down to an equation or whatever and that type of thing. And there are a lot of theories on ethics. There's Aristotle. There's all sorts of different ethical theories and stuff like that out there. But we all kind of understand what it is, and when somebody behaves unethically and what that means in that context. If we look at a classic text, or a classic dictionary definition of this, and I pulled this out of Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, it says the discipline dealing with what is good and bad, and with moral duty and obligation, moral principles, moral values, conduct, guiding philosophy. We see a bunch of words that are scattered throughout there. And again, it's all this stuff that's thrown together, and it all is kind of related, but it all doesn't necessarily mean the same exact thing. It's sort of like going back to when we talk about accuracy and precision. We know that there's a relationship between those two concepts, but there's enough difference between them that we can't necessarily use them interchangeably in that type of thing. So when we talk about good and bad, what does good and bad mean? What are moral principles and principles of conduct based on whose frame of reference? So a lot of this stuff here is really mushy. It's really fuzzy type of definitions. But we can look at values. We look at values, morals, and laws. Those are kind of the three big areas we want to look at. Values are the personal beliefs in which we have individually some sort of emotional investment. Punctuality. If you never want to be late for some thing when you're going somewhere, that's a value that you have. You don't want to be late. When you want to do a job and do it right, there's a value that you have with respect to that. Character, integrity, accountability. These are a bunch of words that we see tossed about with respect to values. Morals, whoops, I got ahead of myself here. Wow, this one here. Morals are the rules which guide our decisions about how we're going to achieve those values for a particular situation. For example, I'm not a runner. I got bad knees. My knees gave out on me years and years ago. But if I do decide I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to compete in a marathon, whether it's mini marathon or full marathon, the task is running that marathon. My value is I want to complete that marathon. I don't care if I finish first or last or somewhere in the middle. To me, it's personal satisfaction I derive with being able to finish that. Now, my moral framework is I run the entire circuit. I go from beginning to end the entire circuit. I don't take any shortcuts. I don't take any rides or anything like that. I do it on my own. Put it in terms of a survey situation. We're reestablishing a public land survey corner. Okay, the value, sufficient for the purpose at hand. Do we need to have that position, that PLSS position, because we're retracing a description and it's our point of commencement? So we got to start it somewhere. We've got some certainty of location. Or is it because we're going to remonument that corner and we need to perpetuate it towards the future? So my moral framework that I've got there is what degree of evidence do I need to achieve either one of those particular values? I may have a higher need of evidence if I'm going to perpetuate that position and document that than if I'm going to do accepting a position and using it as a point of commencement to do a description, to retrace a description. Right. And now, come on, click. Now, we look at that when we say, well, that's for sure. But do we have a flexible moral framework? Okay. Are we willing to bend the rules a little bit based on the situation? Okay. I've been working on restoring my car for years. I may never ever accomplish it, but I've been working on it. So, I may look at it and say, I'd like to have an old classic Mustang. Classic Mustang's not going to break the bank. That's one of those things where I can probably swing that with the finances that I have currently. But boy, that Cobra over there, that's really a sharp looking car. In order to achieve to own that, to get the satisfaction from that, I may have to change what my moral framework is for what I'm going to do to try to get that. And all of a sudden, Tom Selleck and his reverse mortgages starts to look pretty damn attractive on TV. I might start considering doing that and talk to my wife about it later on. So is there some flexibility in that moral framework that I use in order to achieve that value or that satisfaction? Now, the other way we can look at it is going again to a construction type of situation. Say we've got a relationship between an inspector and a contractor on a job. And the inspector helps the contractor get through a situation or kind of grease the skids a little bit to get something accomplished. And sort of a pat on the back with a type of thing, the contractor decides, well, I'm going to reward this guy. He says, I'd like to say thanks for helping by giving you a company hat and a pen. Okay. How many of you got hats that have got vendor names on them or got company names on them that you don't belong to, or pens that are in your pen holders and stuff like that you picked up at different places and that type of thing? Real innocuous. That's no big deal. What if he decides to give you a pickup truck instead? Okay. So all of a sudden now, maybe it's not that good of a situation type of thing. Congress uses $50, by the way, as a cutoff point. Anything below $50 is perfectly acceptable with them. Anything of value $50. Anything above $50, then I ask a question: how they came up with $50? Who knows? But so they have a definite hard line in there and that type of thing. But the point is if I look at the hat and the pen at one end, that's pretty easy to understand. That's no big deal. That's not going to have an influence on me as the inspector as to what I'm going to or not going to do in the future. A truck, on the other hand, is, say, at the other extreme, and that doesn't look as well. That could definitely have an impact on how I decide to do things. So the question then becomes, is there a tipping point somewhere in between? Okay. Is there something in there that says, okay, I can see at the edges what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, but somewhere in between, is there a crossover point? Is there a place in here where I decide, yeah, I can kind of go towards that car, and no, it's still over to this side right here? Where does it become less okay to accept the vehicle or something of that magnitude as opposed to something over here? Where's right, where's wrong? Because that was one of those definitions we had back in, we talked about ethics, a definition from Merriam-Webster says the difference between right and wrong. Well, what's the difference between right and wrong in those situations? Okay. Now, when we talk about law, okay, that is a set of rules that are established by a group. They're established by and enforced by a group. And they reflect, or they're supposed to reflect, the values and the morals binding on those group members. And that group can be society, in which case we have statutes, ordinances, and all those types of things that we as society members have to adhere to. Or it can be a company, and there might be corporate policies within the company, like dress codes and this type of thing. Violation of those laws is penalized by the group. And that is within the police power that exists for that particular group. Okay? And you can't penalize anybody outside that group because the rules don't apply, or the laws don't apply to those groups. But that's something that's formalized. That's generally written down somewhere that everybody can see and say, yep, I can do that. I can't do that, because it says so right in the written rules and the laws. So when we look at ethics, basically it's a systematized moral principles framework for making a decision where values conflict. And we don't normally have a moral, we don't generally have an ethical conflict within ourselves. It's when our values conflict with other values or other people's values that we have to start worrying about, well, what's right or wrong, where are the tipping points and that type of thing. How do we hold our values in the context of other people's values? Now, outside the family unit, the very first ethical code that we were all probably exposed to was when we went to school, because that's the first place really when we had to interact with others outside of the family unit. And we had to be cognizant of other people's values and feelings and those types of things. And we basically learned our first code. And our first code was, don't hurt anybody, tell the truth, and respect your parents and teachers, or respect your elders, and that type of thing. And so that became our first framework, and we built on that as we matured and went on through life. So if we were to come up with a perfect ethical code, if such a thing were to exist, we should be able to apply it uniformly regardless of the situation. So we can say, well, here's my ethical code. I apply it like that here. I apply it like that here. No gray areas whatsoever. I understand what the right and wrong is, and I can move forward in life. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. We have a lot of gray area in between. Here's the truck at one end. Here's the pen and hat at the other end. And in between is a whole big gray area. And the question is when do we go from one extreme to the other? Where are those tipping points in between them? And that's going to be dependent on perspective, interaction with other people's value or the valuation of the situation that we deal with. There's a whole lot of things that start to come into play in that respect. Okay, so if we look at like how laws come into place, say society frowns on killing other people. You know, that's generally pretty much against the law to kill other people, right? We can all agree that random killing is pretty unethical. It's not only illegal, it's unethical to just randomly kill people. So we've got a uniform ethical application in that situation. Don't kill versus kill, ethical versus unethical. But what if we change the circumstances, those tipping points in there? What if it's an accidental killing? What if it's the castle doctrine? What if it's self-defense? Do we start to look at different, whether it's ethical or non-ethical in that context, as opposed to the extremes, random killing versus no killing at all? So we've got that gray area in between. How do we start to look at that? Where those tipping points come in? All right, can we base laws, ethics on laws? Okay, it'd be a simplest way to do this is laws are structured and known, and they address societal concerns and they define penalties. We all know that all the regulations that affect surveying generally will start out with a paragraph that says these laws exist for what? What reason do these exist? For the benefit of the public, the benefit and the protection of the public, right? So we should be able to write laws to do that, or can we? Well, society members have a responsibility to know, understand, and obey the laws. That's where the ignorance of the law is no excuse comes from. Just because you didn't know that was against the law doesn't preclude you from, as being a member of society, not knowing that, because they're written down. You can find those out. Yeah. All right, so now I'm camping with my wife, and my wife has a stroke. So I put her into the car and drive as fast as I can to an emergency room at a hospital that's 15 miles away. In the process, I drive as fast as I can and still keep that vehicle under control, but I'm far exceeding the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. A cop car sees me, clocks me, sees I'm going real fast, turns on a siren, the light starts following me, and I ignore him, and I keep heading for the hospital. Okay. Now, were my actions ethical? Anybody want to answer that? Were they ethical? Why was I doing this? To save my wife's life. I felt she was in imminent danger. So was what I was doing ethical? I put a high value on my wife's life, and I wanted to be sure that she was safe. So yeah, I think it was pretty ethical. Were my actions legal?
No.
No, because I exceeded the speed limit, I ignored the cop car and all this kind of stuff. So here's the case where I've got ethical action, or what I believe is ethical action, but in the process, there's some illegal activities or illegal actions I take in the process of achieving that. Now, what if I'd lost control of the car and hit another car and kept on going? Well, a hit and run is not as forgivable as speeding, right? They might, my cop might say, well, with speeding, we understand that, but you were hit and run. You didn't stop and render aid. Or if I hit somebody and I killed them or I hurt them seriously. Or I got to the ER and we pulled my wife in there and they said, oh, she just got heartburn. Okay. She doesn't have a heart attack. Now, these things, none of those things happen until after I made my decision. I decided to act with respect to the situation. Should I have anticipated them? Possibly. Did I have time to anticipate them? That's the other thing that comes into play. Did I have time to contemplate the actions, the potential actions, before making a rational decision as to what to do? No, the situation dictated that I behaved, that I believed I had to behave right away. Do I have control over any of those? To a certain extent, I do or I don't. So when I look at this, laws may be good for saying what's right or wrong in the context of society, but they don't necessarily address what is ethical or non-ethical in the case of particular situations. So we can kind of use two real simplified diagrams here. We can use legal, illegal. We have but one circle on one side, and we take all the actions that are possible for someone to perform, and we divide them into two categories, legal and illegal. And chances are there is a lot more illegal activities than there are legal activities. Let's say there's a dividing line. There's a very distinct dividing line between the two. 55 miles an hour. Above 55, it's illegal. Below 55, you're okay. Ethical or unethical? This is where our moral principles and our valuation comes into play. This is where I make the decision that I'm going to do something about my wife's health as soon as I can. So all my actions can be divided up into ethical and unethical. When I overlay the two on top of each other, okay, that's where I have the combinations of actions that are unethical and legal, unethical and illegal, ethical and illegal, and ethical and illegal. Those are the four combinations I can have. And what I did when I rushed to the hospital was ethical and illegal. I broke the speed limit. I ignored the cop. But there's a certain forgiveness that can be in that context because of the reason that I was doing it, was why I was behaving in that fashion. Here's a kicker. It's not everybody has the same ethical perspective. Right? Everybody is subject to the same legal and illegal acts, but not everybody has the same ethical perspective because let's face it, we don't all have the same values. We don't have the same moral principles of the framework. So we're all going to have different ethical perspectives with respect to actions. So if I were to take an action, that little yellow burst there on the bottom there, and say that's a legal action under all circumstances, but I overlay that with these different perspectives of ethical perspectives. For some people, that may be ethical and legal. For some, it might be unethical, even though it's legal. And for some, it's right on that boundary area, that fuzzy boundary, that tipping point between, this way versus that way type of thing. So again, depending on our individual values, we can have different perspectives with respect to that. Now, so we're talking about law and ethics. It's a symbiotic relationship. They're related, they concern the same actions, but they're still kind of separate. And the proportions of legal and illegal and ethical and unethical change over time. An example of that is marijuana. 20 years ago, it was illegal to possess or smoke marijuana, right? Hard and fast against the law. Now we're seeing more states adopt recreational marijuana laws to make it legal. So what happens is over time, legal and illegal can change. At what age can you start drinking? At what age can you start voting? The legal, illegal starts to change. By the same token, that ethical model that we first developed or were exposed to in kindergarten, we built on that from our experiences that we've had interacting with other people and other perspectives and worldviews and that type of thing, have caused us to come up with a more refined ethical model and maybe a little bit more different fuzziness in between them. Things aren't as cut and dry and that type of thing. So as we get older, that stuff starts to change a bit. And another distinction between laws and ethics is, and this is a really important one, laws involve compliance. Ethics involve choice. We choose to do something or not something. Laws involve compliance. You either comply with the law or you don't comply with the law. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Okay? So that's all personal ethics from individual viewpoint. What about professional ethics? Well, when we talk about professional ethics, we've got to look at what constitutes a profession. A profession consists of individuals who share specialized skill and knowledge. Okay? And they have a set of values associated with that profession, which helps maintain its integrity. Now, so we're a bunch of surveyors. We got a bunch of engineers. We got a bunch of doctors. Those are all recognized professions. Who's in charge of a profession? Well, generally, the way we normally think of this is a profession is understood because it has a licensing or certification authority associated with it. So the authority is that agency or that body or that entity which has that type of control over the people within that profession and defines things like minimum competency and that type of thing. Usually it's government based. Most of us are licensed by a Department of Regulation and Licensing or Public and Safety Services or whatever that's established at the state level. Okay? Same thing with engineers and that type of thing. But there are some self-regulating professions like the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, that type of thing. But basically, it's generally an entity that's got that licensing authority. And because it's government-based for the most part, it defines things like government does in terms of law. There are rules, there are regulations, there are statutes, and it affects all the licensed professionals within that profession. Now, it doesn't affect non-licensed professionals because you can't pull a license of somebody who's not licensed. So once you start to get outside that, then you're starting to get into coloring, the gray area type of thing. Now, a professional organization are individuals that group together to represent and advance their profession. Why do we belong to state societies? Why do we belong to a national organization? Because it provides us a framework for growth for the profession and individuals. So the professional organization serves us as members, and we as members serve the professional organization. And we want to use that to maintain the integrity of the profession. We want to be looked at as professionals and treated as professionals. And one way to do that is to develop an ethical code. And we identify value areas within there and provide guidance to the members. The policing body that we have with respect to that is generally some ethics committee or standards of practice committee within the profession, within the organization, that can review what's happening with their members. And the only exercise, the only police power, quote unquote, that they have are over members of that organization. You can't, I mean, you can revoke the membership or a certification if you issue a certification, like say, for instance, NSPS offers the Certified Surveying Technician program. And if somebody behaves in an unacceptable fashion with respect to NSPS's creeds and canons, they have the authority. They can't pull that person's license if they're a licensed land surveyor because that's not within their authority, but they can pull their certified survey technician certification because that's something that they provided as a service to the member. So it's limited with respect to who they can exercise this authority over. Now, when we look at land surveying in general, we have two great big bodies of laws that we deal with all the time. Boundary creation establishments based on written law and common law. And all of our decisions and actions are based on some sort of legal framework. Now, I know we can all run out there buy the newest GPS receiver, or we got a brand new truck and all this kind of, all those things are tools that allow us to act and practice our profession within a legal framework. Now, there's the two legal frameworks that we have are the written and the common. The written is the statutory regulation. Okay? Inevitably, all of our actions and responsibilities could be legally regulated. And pretty much every, well, I don't want to say this because I have a limited sampling, but a lot of states have laws or administrative codes that cover two things: minimum standards and professional conduct or ethical responsibilities. Now, the minimum standards, that's a whole nother area that we can go off into on a tangent and discuss for another night and that type of thing. But basically, minimum standards, when we talk about boundary creation, that's covered by statute law. Resurvey is covered by common law. Now, statute law is that stuff that's written down. And we'll have subdivision regulations, condominium regulations. If you look at them, they go into detail. They say what your minimum mapping requirements are, what your layout requirements are, all this kind of thing, all the numbers and stuff are in there. It tells you pretty much how you're going to do something. And that's true not just of subdivision regulations, but if you look at the 2009 or the 73 Manual of Instructions for the Public Land Survey System, that's got all sorts of standards and specifications in it for how you're going to perform a survey, the original surveys. Common law doesn't have any of that stuff. Common law doesn't have a set of rules that says, well, you have to do all the surveys this way, or you have to do it this way, or these are the minimum accuracies that you have to achieve. It's all based on court decisions. And generally, inevitably, what it boils down to is, what would a competent surveyor do? What constitutes a competency in a surveyor for performing a resurvey? So a lot of states will create minimum standards to provide some general specifications for resurvey technical specifications, and to serve as a safety net if a particular type of boundary creation method doesn't address sufficient detail on that. For an example I always use in Wisconsin is we have cemetery plats. You guys have cemetery plats? Cemetery plats, cemetery lots are very, very small lots, right? You don't monument the four corners of a lot of a cemetery lot, but there are still standards for that. And in Wisconsin, they're very general, and they say that basically refer to the minimum standards as the safety net. Okay, if it's not otherwise regulated, this comes into play. So they act as a kind of a safety net that grab anything that falls through the cracks. In Wisconsin, our administrative code, this is just to give you an idea of how it's laid out, scope definitions, survey report requirements, and that's something new that we added this last time around, the last couple of years. Boundary location, description, maps, relative positional accuracy measurements, monuments, and public land survey and monument. And it's about 3 pages long, 3 or 4 pages long. It's not a lot of detail, but if you look at it, it's the emphasis is on professional judgment for resurveys. Every property survey shall be made in accordance with the records of the register of deeds as nearly as practicable. Who decides that? The competent surveyor. Measurements shall be made with instruments and methods capable of attaining the relative positional accuracy in accordance with this section. Whereas in the subdivision regulations, it says specifically the types of monuments and the weight per linear foot that you'll use. On resurveys, it says it's up to the surveyor to make the judgment as to what are the appropriate monumentation criteria. It's up to the surveyor to decide where the corners go based on evaluation of the evidence. So the minimum standards, although they've got some numbers in them, still leave a lot to judgment. The other thing that is generally regulated or appears in the regulations is professional conduct or an ethical code. And that's generally part of the administrative law or the administrative code for the licensing agency. And in Wisconsin, ours falls under AE8 professional conduct, and this covers not just surveyors, but also landscape architects, and engineers and designers. We're all licensed under the same board or under the same authority and that type of thing. Now, the administrative code exists because legislation passed by the legislature enables this agency to have that rulemaking authority. So you'll see a lot of times, or a lot of the references in these things, where they'll loop back to the state statutes. Okay, so like AE 802, the intent, rules of professional conduct, and it relates back to state statute 443.11 and 443.13. In 443.12, which is right in the middle of there, it says that it is for any gross negligence, incompetence, or misconduct in the practice of professional land survey. Well, how do you define that? It's kind of a circular argument type thing. It's as well as really mushy type of definitions. Again, it goes back to what would a minimum competent surveyor do in these particular situations. So when we have these statutory regulation of professional conduct, it's not really hard and fast. If we look at the national level, at NSPS, which most of us belong to, a lot more states now have the joint co-membership with, we have the Surveyor's Creed and Canons. And I don't have the creed in here, that's the preamble part that leads into this, but these are the canons. And these are basically what it says a surveyor should and shouldn't do. Professional surveyor should refrain from conduct that is detrimental to the public. Okay, that makes sense. It's a feel-good type of thing. Should abide by the rules and regulations pertaining to the practice of surveying within the licensed jurisdiction. And if you go through all of those, you see that they're all relatively general statements. There's nothing in there that's hard and fast that says you will or will not do this. The one that I like is where's the one about advertising? There's one in there that says you shouldn't. Oh yeah, number 6. Should use care to avoid advertising or solicitation that is misleading, otherwise contrary to the public interest. How do you remember? And this happened about 25, 30 years ago. Lawyers never used to advertise because they didn't think that was ethically proper for the profession to advertise. They never had any TV ads and stuff. And then they decided, no, that's not true. Everybody's advertising. So now we've got this flood of advertising on every other commercial on TV now is a lawyer's ad and that type of thing. But there was a time when the legal profession looked very, very much down on advertising because it was self-laudatory and was below the respect or the ethics of the profession and that type of thing. So again, it's one of those things that over time changes, the perspective changes on it. At the state level, we have state associations, and I've done this before, but I decided to revisit this in this last week or so. I did a limited sampling of about 6 or 7 states, starting with Wisconsin, because Wisconsin used to have a pretty detailed ethical code for the state surveying society, and we no longer have one. And the reason we don't have one is because since we've become affiliated with NSPS, the state societies decided to adopt that as our ethical model, as opposed to coming up with another one that could be potentially contradictory or too detailed, that type of thing. And a couple of other states that I looked at that have got affiliation with NSPS have done similar things. A few others, I looked at their websites and I couldn't find anything about their ethical codes or any professional conduct, or even if they had any committees that were like an ethical standards of practice committee, that type of thing. And I contacted a number of these states and I got a response from one. And from quite a few of them, what I did find out was they do have some ethical code, whether it's a separate one or one that's in conjunction with NSPS, but it's in a members only area. You can't see it if you visit the website, which to me, I think is terrible. If I'm a client and I want a potential client, and I want to look at a surveying society and I want to look at what that surveying society is about, wouldn't having your ethical code available to that person be a nice thing as opposed to hiding it and not knowing if this society has got ethics or not? So to me, I always thought it was kind of odd that it would be back behind a firewall where the public couldn't see it. But a number of state agents or state societies are like that. Well, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a published code? And one of the things I found out when I talking with Wisconsin, some of the people in Wisconsin, was one of the reasons they decided to go with the NSPS code was because it was so general. It's really doesn't really nail things down. And if you try to make it any more detailed than that, then they're afraid that it'll be used against you in a court of law. This is what your society says are your ethical standards. Are you in fact not living up to them? So if you make it too detailed, the question is can it come back to bite you and later on type of thing? Is keeping it general a better way to do it? The other hand of it is, the other side is it does act as a guiding light for the people that are part of that profession. But again, if I don't belong to the state society, it has no bearing on me and affect my practice as a land surveyor in the state of Wisconsin. Because by belonging to the organization, I buy into that. If I don't belong to the organization, that doesn't apply to me. So that standard can't be applied to someone who doesn't belong to the organization that established that standard. So there's advantages and disadvantages of published codes, particularly if you get real detailed or make them too general. Okay, so what does it all boil down to? And this is what I always come up with at the end. You go all the way back to kindergarten. Don't hurt anyone, tell the truth, and respect others. And basically, when you look at the ethical codes, that's what it all boils down to, whether it's personal ethics or professional ethics. Okay. This is where I differ from a lot of other people, because now when we get into these ethics, we know the theories and stuff. At this point, I stop saying, I'm done talking about ethics, because I probably say everything I want to say about ethics. And instead, what we do is we look at some case studies and see if we've got ethical situations in there, and what are the tipping points, and what are the things that can make it ethical or non-ethical, legal, illegal, and all that kind of stuff. So if you've got that paper, I had 4 cases in there, and I gave you a bunch of questions or considerations to think about before you, as you look through those. First of all, consider, is there in fact an ethical dilemma? Okay. And if there is, does the surveyor's creed and canons from NSPS and or your state society's ethical code or ethical rules provide you sufficient guidance to make a decision, or kind of make a decision that you can live with respect to the situation? If there is no dilemma, is there a tipping point at which it would in fact become an ethical dilemma? If we change it a little bit, because we always do this with when I taught my legal courses, when we talk about evidence and that type of thing, and you'd say, well, if you had this and this kind of evidence, this is what you'd probably come up with the solutions to where the property corner is. But if you had this little piece of evidence in here, that might change the picture entirely. So the question is, again, with ethical situations, is if we look at this case here, but then we change it a little bit, does that start to swing it in one way or the other? If it is an ethical dilemma and you find yourself in it, can something be changed to remove it from that ethical dilemma situation, at least from your perspective in that respect? Is there a legal element which affects your decision? Well, instead of worrying about whether it's ethical or not, I'm looking at whether it's legal. If it's illegal or legal, then at that, I'll make a decision based on that. If ethics are involved, are they professional or are they personal? Remember, when we look at the creed and canons from NSPS and the ones from our state societies, those are for our professional conduct. But how does our personal values come into play with respect to that? Okay? Again, that's that maturation and the evolution that we have as we go through life. What other parties might be affected and how? Because remember, the ethical conflicts a lot of times come from when different values clash, and we have to try to resolve what happens in those situations. And what other factors could change your ethical stance, and what happens if ethical perspectives clash. Sometimes walking away from it is the way to deal with it, right? All right, now, what I'm going to do is I'll throw out this first one. I want to do the first one because the first one is one that I always run every year. I have this happen, or I've had this happen when I was teaching. So real quickly, let me go through the basic scenario for that one. I don't have it here in front of me, but I can kind of recite it real quickly. A person calls up the school, calls up UW-Platteville, and they want to talk to somebody that teaches a surveying class. So eventually they get routed to me and ask me if I've got a class that would like a project to work on. And inevitably what they want is a property survey performed. And I'll look and I'll say, well, in Wisconsin, a property survey has to be performed by or under the direction of a licensed land surveyor. My students are not licensed. So the next question generally is, well, are you licensed? And I say, yes, I am licensed. I said, well, then can't the students do the work under your supervision? And then you could sign off on their survey, their work and all that stuff. And I said, well, I could, but then you're asking me to put my license on the line with respect to my students, and they're not really equipped to do that. and it goes back and forth. And ultimately what the person wants is for me to perform the survey for them, or have my students perform the survey for them to accomplish that for them. And they get a free survey, the students get experience, and everybody comes out happy. Now, is there an ethical dilemma there? If you were in my situation, would you have an ethical dilemma? Would it be illegal for me to have my students do it and then me sign off on the work for it if they do it under my direction and I verify that all the work is done correctly and I sign off on it? Is there anything illegal about that activity?
Are you taking money?
Good question. No, in my case, I'm not going to take money for it because my students are going to be doing the work for it, and I don't think it's fair that I get paid for it. So, okay, so I'll take money out of the equation.
Are you going to be in the field with them?
It has to be done under my direction. So it has to be something I'm comfortable with having them do and me sign off on. So yeah, I would have to have some sort of supervision over them to ensure that they're doing things correctly. Okay, so.
As long as your employer knows that you're doing some side work,
yeah,
not getting paid.
As a matter of fact, I've been in situations where the employer encouraged that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Teaching environments, because it did give the students actual expertise or experience with respect to that.
Let's see, Joanne, I don't think it's illegal. I just left on my Zoom. I don't think it's illegal under your direction. It is for commercial entity, private party, or nonprofit. Does the school agree? So yeah, just kind of the same questions we just asked. But I would say it is not unethical in my mind.
I've never done it. I refuse to do it because to me it is unethical.
Okay.
And let me explain to you why. Remember, one of the other things to consider was who else is affected by this. Why did I get to call? Why did I get to call in the first place?
Yep.
Was I the first one they called?
Right.
No, they called the surveyor. And they found out that it was going to cost some money. So they called the university or the technical college because there's a class that can do it for free. Okay. All right. So that's what. Now, if I do that job, what else am I doing?
Yeah.
What equipment am I using?
Oh, yeah. School equipment, right?
Yeah. Who paid for that equipment?
Right. Taxpayers.
Public,
Yeah. The surveyors that I'm competing with, right?
Yeah, it's unfair competition.
They have the flexibility to use to write off their equipment that way that I do, right? You see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
It is that when I start to broaden that perspective, and I look at it's not just me and the person that's that wants me to do this work or my students to do this work, it's who else is being affected by that. All right, now let's change it a little bit more. Instead of a private owner, let's make this a church group. Does that change things any?
Not really.
Potentially, right?
Could.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, what if it's a local unit of government? And we're providing a service to the community. So again, you got to start to look at it, and when you start to expand it and look at other perspectives and other values that are involved in there, you start to think that, well, I might not, with my narrow blinders on, think that this might be an unethical situation. But once I start to look at that in a wider scope, that's why I've never done it. I've never ever wanted to be put in a situation where I go to a chapter meeting, and at that chapter meeting, one of the guys says, why were you guys out there doing a survey with the equipment that we paid for?
Student presentation.
So I could say, well, we did it for nothing. We didn't make any money off it. They said, that doesn't make any difference. You took money out of our pockets to do that type thing. And on top of that, we paid for the equipment. So see, it's something even as simple as that can be cause an ethical dilemma, you know, and some people are perfectly fine doing that.
I was going to say, that's where I was going to go. Yeah. So another professor may not see the same views as you, right?
Yeah,
And so-
yeah, and I just never felt comfortable being in that situation. So I figured it's one of those things where it's better not to get involved, to put not only myself in that situation, but also my students, because now they're a party to the action. And what kind of message does that sound? Because part of what I'm doing as an instructor is not just teaching them, I'm proving as a role model for them.
Correct.
You know, so if they see it's okay to use, taxpayer paid equipment for this, then, you know, how would you feel if somebody that works for the DOT brought home equipment from the job site and did surveying on weekends?
That's never happened. That's never happened.
Never happens. Never happens.
Never.
But see, it gets, and this is the kind of stuff that when we talk about ethics, these types of discussions to me are much more valuable than saying, okay, here's the Aristotle method of ethics, you know, and this rules and all this kind of stuff. It's when you start to look at this, start to expand it out. Let's look at another case. One of my favorites is the easement that's not on a map. I got to pull my document up because I got to see this one because I want to be sure that I get the whole thing.
I did put the handout. I put the handouts
this is the third one
in the chat.
And this is I've had. I'm sorry. You said there was something in the chat.
No, I put your handouts in the chat, and I also put the NSPS canon creeds and canyons in there as well.
Yeah, the third case, and I usually I actually have about 7 or 8 of these that I do, and they get into some detail. So when we do group discussions, we get into some really interesting stuff, particularly with remonumentation and all that type of stuff. The case number 3, it's a little bit longer description wise, but basically what it boils down to is that Smith hired a surveyor to survey his property, retraced the lines as per the description. Compared to joiners, didn't find any conflicts. Smith's description includes a reference to a recorded document indicating an easement for a power company, but he didn't perform a title search for the easements. Instead, he just included in this certificate the statement that, and subject to all easements of record. That's a real common thing for surveyors to do around here, is to always put on there, and subject to all easements of record. 2 months after the survey, Smith builds a shed on his house using the information from the survey and building setbacks and stuff, so he's not encroaching on the zoning regulations and all that type of stuff. And then a little bit later, Badgerland Power notifies Smith that it's going to put a power line across his property, and they're going to exercise the right to their easement. And his shed is right where that power line is supposed to go. So they tell him that he's got to either move his shed, or they will move it and bill him for it. And he's upset. So he goes back to the surveyor and he says to the surveyor, look, it's going to cost me money because you didn't indicate this easement on my map. And the surveyor says, look, it says on there in my certificate, and subject to all easements of record. So I put you on notice that there's a potential conflict there. So I can't be held responsible for this. What do you think?
I think he should have done some more research.
Well, it says in our administrative code that the resurveys will be done as close as practicable to the records of the Register of Deeds. And this is one of those situations where it's not an unrecorded easement, because we've got those. I mean, you search back and there's no easement there or a drop down or that type of thing. There's a certain limit to the responsibility you have with respect to that. But what about putting a disclaimer on there that says, and subject to any easements of record? So it kind of is like my get out of jail free card. What do you think of that?
I think that's an easy way out. And I will say, typically here in Nevada, a lot of times on records of survey, we don't show all the easements. And a lot of times we note that we're not showing easements just because it's a pain in the tail to do it. It's not because we didn't get a title report, because we almost always get a title report where I work. But it sometimes it's just easier not to do that. It's a can of worms sometimes. But I think that note's an easy way out. I really do.
What
Well,
were the
I've
scope of services?
I've also seen notes on maps that have say this information is warranted for 1 year after date of completion. Can you put a limit? I've seen it on there.
Wouldn't work in Nevada.
There's nothing that says you can't have that on there
Right.
in the minimum standards.
Right.
Trent,
when
do you
it
think
says-
that would work in Nevada, that note? I don't think so.
See, I don't know. Again, jurisdictionally, that may vary from place to place. It's again how minimum competency is defined jurisdictionally within an area. And if there's any manuals, some states have a manual of practice also. Ours is relatively loose. Okay, we've got the AE7, which is the minimum standards, and then we have professional conduct AE8. And AE7 has in there that you will perform the resurvey as closely to the record, the record of the register of deeds as practicable. My question is what is practicable? Does by saying and subject to any easements of record, a practical thing, a practicable way to cover it? Or is Joe Public, because he hired a professional, putting a lot of faith into the product that the professional gives him so that when he sees this map, he thinks that's what actually represents his rights on the ground now or not? Would he have any other reason to believe otherwise? See what I'm getting at?
And I'll go back to your original, like on the very first paragraph, I was just rereading it again, but did not perform any title research for easements. So.
For the easement, he did, right?
Oh, the easement he did. He just didn't show it on there. Okay.
Well, he didn't perform it for the easement itself. He just basically said, give me your deed. He looked at the deed, surveyed the deed on the ground. It didn't conflict with any of the adjoiners. Okay? And the description includes subject to an easement for power line purposes or whatever. He didn't go find that document to see what it was subject to.
So
But here's the question though, what were the scope of services? The scope of services were to define the deeded property line. It didn't say anything about the actual easement, even though that it is in the recorded document. It didn't say anything about the easement in this sentence.
right. That's the first question to the client, right? What are you using this survey for?
Right. Yeah, and then if he's not going to do easements, he needs to specifically state that in the scope of services that he's not going to provide information in that area.
And that's one thing that we had within our AE7, our minimum standards, was that the client and the surveyor could agree to excluding certain things from the provisions of the minimum standards. The only thing they couldn't exclude from there was the map itself. A map still had to be produced. That's been modified to a certain extent because we never used to have survey reports before, but now we've incorporated survey reports in there, which come in really handy if you're resurveying a property that was resurveyed not that long ago to begin with, and the situation hasn't changed much. So a surveyor's report can be used to help explain some of that kind of stuff. But yeah, it goes down to, again, and somebody said, well, you asked the client, what is he going to use the map for? Well, is that going to affect the quality with which you establish the property lines?
No, it doesn't. That doesn't
No.
change that, but it changes what your deliverable is, right? If he says, hey, I'm going to build a shed in the northeast corner of my parcel and I want to know where I can place it legally.
Then you're
place
going to
it.
want to show setbacks and
Yeah.
any easements.
Yeah.
Exactly.
My
Exactly.
contention is that when you provide him that product, and again, he's thinking this is a product from professional because he paid a chunk of money
Yeah.
for it.
He doesn't know what he doesn't know. Yeah.
He doesn't know what he doesn't know. And then later on, he says, well, I'm going to build a shed and I'm going to use the information off the survey map to do that. That may not have been his original intent to do it, but because he has that product and it's on file with the county surveyor's office, it's filed and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Is there a certain reliance that that client has on that? And that we might be kind of getting around by saying, well, there's other information there that I might not have found, who can find that? But well, you can go to an attorney or you can go to an abstract company. The question is do they know that? Is there a certain reliance? So again, when you expand that out and start to look at other perspectives and values and that type of thing, you start to wonder, if I'm viewing it as ethical, and I'm okay with this, later on, when they have to pay for moving that shed, are they viewing it through the same rosy colored, ethical glasses that we're looking through? Okay.
But I think if it's referenced in the deed, you have that responsibility to go get that document and plot it. If it's referenced in the deed, you should be showing it.
And it's constructive notice to the homeowner too, as well, though. His deed says subject to those power easements. And then I love Ryan's comment. Sorry, that was pretty funny, Ryan. He says basically the surgeon, my scope of services, do I need to have him in my scope of services that I need to close up your incision after I have a surgery? Like, it's valid points. That's awesome. I love that.
Presumption is he'll do that, right? The presumption is he'll do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob's got his hand up.
It'll heal on its own.
I know.
Maybe that's where the phrase "suit yourself" comes from.
I love that. Go for it, Rob.
Yeah, well, I think we got to look at how the whole interaction is between the client and the licensed professional, right? I mean, I think too often this kind of situation can occur when the field crew does the boundary and the data comes back in the office and the office makes the plat and the licensee signs it, and that plat is emailed off to the client with no discussion, no meeting, no on-site interaction, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, it's going to come down to, all right, I'm the homeowner, and Joe Surveyor screwed me over with this, is from my perspective, and I'm going to take him to court. And what's the small claims court judge going to do? Right? Despite a lot of good arguments that, hey, we put this disclaimer on there and what were the scope of services, in small claims court, you're going to get a judge that knows
nothing,
jacks about surveying, and you're going to get a judgment for $5,000 to the plaintiff or whatever the small claims court limit is, right? And a black mark on your reputation. So I guess from the purely ethical world that we should be living in, is we have to just say that, hey, when here's this product and now the items that are not plotted are these easements of record that I asked for, that you didn't provide to me, whatever, that I didn't go research myself, that my title company contact didn't provide to me. And the owner's going to say, well, I'm going to build this shed. What's that going to do for me? Then you're going to end up with saying, give me that back. I got to do some research and I'll plot the easements on there.
Still got to pay to move a shed, though.
Well, hopefully this is all happening before you move before the shed gets built.
Well, see, and that's why we had the session couple of weeks ago on contracts.
Yeah.
And those of you that do it with Alta surveys know that there's the checkoffs on the back for optional things that you want to include. That's why it's important that, and I think the point about communication is absolutely critical, not just between the surveyor and the client, but as you said, within the organization. Yeah. You got one entity that's responsible for collecting the data, another entity is responsible for reducing that data, and one doesn't necessarily understand what the other is doing or how they're collecting or what they're doing with that information, then yeah, you're bound to have problems. And then when the finger pointing does come back, then who's on the hook for it? Well, it's you, the guy that put the stamp on there, because it was under your direction. And that's where, that something under there fell apart and that type of thing. But communication, I think, is important with respect to that. Talking to the client about, yeah, what are you going to do with this? Is it for conveyance purposes? Are you going to be doing any improvements on the property and that type of thing? Are you aware of any other type? That all that kind of stuff is important. But we have a tendency to kind of shoot past that kind of stuff now because we got technology now. We can go out there with our GPS and just survey the crap out of everything, and we got all the problems solved in that type of stuff. But again, when you look at the technology, those are the tools that allow us to do our job. Our job has still got that ethical side that is associated with it. What responsibility do we have to our clients? What kind of care do they expect from us? You look at title insurance. Everybody pays for title insurance. That's just one of the standard things you pay for when you buy a house. What does title insurance say? Well, it specifically doesn't include those things. It won't cover those things that a proper ground survey would show. Like encroachments and that type of thing. And a lot of surveyors don't like to show encroachments because that implies that we're making a decision with respect to a boundary. That we're dealing with something that may be an unwritten right, that type of thing. So they'll back away from that kind of stuff. So title insurance on one side says we're not going to cover for those types of things. The surveyors on the other side say, well, we're not equipped to make decisions with respect to that. So where does that leave the client? Well, go see an attorney. How's that going to solve anything?
Exactly.
So instead of saying, well, I want to know what my boundary is, and then getting a definitive solution with respect to that, it kind of gets a runaround with respect to that. So yeah. I think there's an ethical obligation that we have in there that maybe sometimes we're not fully getting up to. I think somebody said, well, we've done it that way. That's all the argument. We've always done it that way, or it's always been like that. That doesn't necessarily make it right.
Yeah.
That's my soapbox.
I love it. There was a couple of hands up. I know you pulled yours back down, John. You just want to chime in or no?
Isn't this much more fun than a regular dry ethics lecture?
Always.
It's this kind of stuff here because people will start to do it, and they'll talk about situations in group discussions that, yeah, we had a situation similar to this. This is what happened. And people learn from that. That's where you learn. That's where your ethical model gets refined. Is not just from your own experiences, but from other people in your profession and the allied profession and their experiences that they've encountered.
Round tables are the best. Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know if it was if somebody's from Arkansas, maybe you can clear me up on this, but it was about 30 years ago or so at one of the chapter meetings of the State Society, and I don't know if it was, I think it was Arkansas, sticks in my mind for some reason. The surveyor started talking about different kinds of surveys and what kind of, let's get an idea of what kind of, what were you charging for this kind of survey? If you had this kind of survey, what would you charge for it? And they were taken to court and accused of unethical price fixing because they were discussing prices of surveys at one of their chapter meetings. So that was viewed as an unethical situation for those surveyors to get caught up. And that wasn't at all what they were doing. But like the comment that was made there is, it may not be a lot of money involved in a court situation, but it's the mark on the reputation. It's the time lost having to prepare and go to court and be in the business is lost in that process. It's all the other stuff that comes into play. So, at what point, and when I made that decision with respect to the school situation, it just wasn't worth any benefit that my students would derive from that. To me, wasn't worth the potential ethical conflicts that would introduce.
Yep. George had his hand up. Go for it, George.
Okay, my first rule of business, I think, comes back to under promise, over deliver. And then regarding this whole conversation, you gotta be in communication with your client. You've got to understand what they want. You've got to be able to figure out what they need because they don't often know what they want. So it's an education process all the time.
That's right.
And then you've got to make sure that you deliver everything that you need to deliver to make sure that there's not a problem down the line. Because I don't know about where you are, but in Nevada, you never get out from under that liability if you make a mistake until it's discovered. And it's usually 20, 25 years down the road. And you know what? It's more expensive then than it was when you did the job.
Right.
Yep. And then Dave Crook put in the chat, which was a good one too. The cost to the client may become an issue, right? And they don't want to pay for you to go through the time and money for you to do the research. So you either need to exclude that from your contract, right? Or at least have that conversation. So that's where.
And that's
Scope of
where
services
the
comes in.
contract is a really important aspect of it, is
Yep.
have it down in writing, so everybody understands what it is.
Yep.
Or walk away from it.
Yep. And it starts with, us educating the client as well and asking those questions to be able to have them answer the certain things. So, so back to the original question, is it ethical or unethical? What?
I think we pretty much settled that, haven't we?
Clear as mud. Clear as
That's,
mud.
that's the one thing about ethics is it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, you're wrong. Somewhere along the line.
And that's, and
To
that's
somebody, yes.
that's what I mean is if you can look at the extremes, it's easy. It's that middle ground. There's the fuzzy stuff in between that it gets to, it's difficult. And it just says, well, if we change it a little bit, and some people say, well, if we educate the client, that clears up the fuzziness somewhat, So again, there's always things that we can do. That's one of the things I had those questions ahead of time is what can we do if it's an unethical or a fuzzy situation to move it more towards the ethical side of things.
Yeah.
And from what I see in Nevada, as far as the board's concerned, most of the problems we have here in Nevada are with ethics. It's with guys not doing stuff they should have done or doing stuff that they shouldn't have done. And if we were all thinking about what we were doing a little harder and trying to be a little fair with our clients and our profession, we'd be a lot better off.
That's
It one of the problems we have within our profession, it says in our professional conduct administrative code that we as surveyors are responsible for reporting any unethical behavior within the profession to the board. And I don't know, I haven't looked at all the other states to see if but I would suspect you've got something similar. The question is how many people have actually done that? Now, in Wisconsin, we had an ethics and standards of practice committee, and that kind of acted as an intermediary. So that if there was a situation with a surveyor, that it would go before the society first, and there would be that educational component for both the client and the surveyor, because sometimes you get a surveyor that's been out there surveying for 30 years, never had any formal education, got licensed based on experience and that type of thing. And they just haven't been keeping up with the changes in the laws and that type of thing. And rather than pull that person's license, maybe what that person needs is some additional education. So if you get involved in that process, that's part of what keeping the profession on top of things and keeping it in the eye of you get doing it, as opposed to, well, he's already done that. We'll just ignore him. It doesn't matter type of thing. He's only hurting himself. Well, he's hurting clients, and every client that you have has got another property on the other side of his line, and that person's being hurt also by any of the substandard practices and that type of thing. So again, when you start to look at those additional perspectives that come into play, it can have a pretty substantial effect. But how well are we at policing ourselves in that respect?
Yeah, that's always been the thing over the years, self-policing.
Let me just do one more here real quick.
All
The very
right.
last one, number 4. This is one that I use this example for a bunch of different types of things in seminars that I do. You're process of reestablishing a corner common in 3 parcels. It appears its location is at a fence corner, point A on that diagram there. And I don't know if everybody, my PDF file didn't come out real good on that. I just noticed that today. But anyway, I think I've got that in my, yeah, right here, in my PowerPoint here. Point A, there's a fence corner, and everybody, the owners around there have been using that as their property line for years, and they've all been in ownership of their land for over 30 years or something like that. So nobody else is aware of any other corner, any other monument that may mark a corner. So it fits everything reasonably well. The trees and fences and edges of fields stuff all line up. They get physical evidence lines up real well. So you figure, well, I'm going to accept that as the corner. And so you're completing your witness ties for it. And an old gentleman comes walking by for a walk, and he sees you and he stops by to talk, because old guys have a tendency to do that. Okay. So he mentions back in the 60s, when he was a young kid, he saw a surveyor place a wooden post and pile some rocks around it near where that fence corner location is. And you see there's the pile of rocks that are about 15 feet to the northeast of it, but you didn't really think much about it, because having grown up on a farm, you've picked more than your share of rock out in the field. And you know that you always put the rock over to the side of the field or the corner at where you can, where it's out of the way and that type. So if you never thought about it. So it's been pretty substantial. It's been added to over the years and that type of thing. Now you look at that, you say, well, there's that stone pile. Potentially there's a corner under there, but you know what? Everybody's pretty much accepted point A as the corner. So if I look at this, I'll say, I remember something about the doctrine of common report that says if a corner is in a reasonable location, everybody accepts it as being true and it can't be disproved, then you can accept it by common report. So it kind of meets those conditions. Plus, if I start changing things here, people are going to get upset. And one of them might get upset is the one that's paying me. And if he gets upset, he might not pay me and that type of thing. So you decide, I'm going to leave the situation alone. So, what do you think?
No. You need to advise all 3 property owners of the possibility of a problem. And then you can sit down with the 3 of them and figure out if you want to do something about it or accept what's there. But they all have to agree. Otherwise,
if they decide they want to accept what's there, does that make, if they accept A as the corner, does that make A the corner?
if they all accept it, they can do what's called a boundary line agreement. And the property lines can be described as you surveyed them. And yes, it can become record.
Also, is there any record of that original corner in the records? It's, I mean, you know, you've got the parole evidence, but you don't know if there was anything ever established that was supposed to be the corner.
I purposely put a lot of ifs in here. It's a lot of ifs in here. So that's the whole point is, what else, in order for me to accept that situation or not accept that situation, what other pieces of information what should I maybe see if there exists, rather than just say on the face of it, this is all I got. Let's make a decision based on that.
Who put it there? Who put that stone monument there? And did he file a map? Was there any documentation associated with it? I mean, there's a lot of research that could be done on both sides of this as far as point A and the stone pile to confirm one or the other or neither as far as that goes. But your obligation is still the same to all 3 property owners. Regardless of whether A is paying for your services or B or C, your obligation is to all 3 of those property owners to come up with the correct answer.
In Wisconsin, in our minimum standards, it says for when you write a description, our descriptions must commence with an original government corner. So I have to start a quarter corner or section corner. I don't know if other states are like that or not. But the idea is to reference it to a recognizable corner and tie it to the overall cadastral network. Now, all it says is it has to tie to a government corner location. It doesn't say you have to identify what's at that corner location. So let's say, for instance, this point A represents the southwest corner of a section, right? You dig back in the records, you see other surveys that are tied to the southwest corner, but they don't describe what they are. Is the southwest corner this point, or is it this point underneath that rock, under that stone pile? Oops, over here. Is it that point A, or is it underneath the stone pile? Because nobody explicitly identified what physical thing they were starting at. You know, and that's what I always, when I do my description writing workshops and time, I always, whenever you start a point of commencement, you don't just say starting at the southwest quarter. You say what it is at the southwest quarter that you're starting at. So that 30 years from now, if a different corner, if different location is accepted as the southwest quarter, okay, say it's 4 feet over to the west, that doesn't automatically mean the description that you had moves 4 feet to the west because the section corner location changed. It's just that what represented the section corner location at that time. So it's, I guess what I'm getting at here is, what do these corners represent over time? And I think somebody said, you know, what other surveys were tied to them and that type of stuff. So when we start to look at that type of stuff, it's what kind of control or authority does a corner location have, not just to the instant properties, but to any others that might be affected by that corner location? Because if we make a decision that might be good to these guys right here, somebody else that used that corner for a point of commencement, say for a different property, that by making this one the corner now doesn't do that person any good up in here because it shifted the position of everything. See? So that's why I say, well, yeah, there's that communication aspect again. Sit down, talk with people. What kind of legal ramifications? I've had surveyors say, well, that's, you just tell them to go see a lawyer. Well, what does that accomplish? You know, I mean, if you know a lawyer who's familiar with boundary law, and if you've worked with before, and you can explain the situation to them, that's somebody that you can direct those people to, because you know he will offer them some concrete legal ways to resolve that type of situation. But to just
Jerry,
say, a lawyer.
Jerry, as professionals, aren't we supposed to solve problems rather than create them?
Right, exactly.
Ethically speaking, yes. But
We don't have all the answers, but
we don't have all the
we can sure collect a lot of evidence to help people find them.
right, and that's why we got to keep coming back to the thing about what would a competent surveyor do in this situation? Because theoretically, if a bunch of surveyors looked at the same situation with the same evidence, they should all arrive at the same conclusion, right? But when you go to court, one side's got their expert witness surveyor, another one's got their expert witness surveyor, and they're both at odds with respect to what the difference is. Well, why is that? Well, they're not looking at the same evidence, or they're not weighing the evidence in the same fashion, right? Because it shouldn't matter which side of the issue that you're on. There is only one solution with respect to the evidence as you're evaluating it, right?
That's why I'm always advising people the worst place you could go is to court.
Of course, yeah.
You need to sit down with your neighbors if there's a problem and come up with a resolution that you can live with, and everybody can be happy, because the last thing you want to do is live on a piece of property where your neighbor hates you and you hate your neighbor. That's never a good situation. So if you can sit down together and agree to something, that makes life easy for everybody.
And document
And
it.
keep the attorneys out of it.
Yeah, document it and make it part of the public record so that it becomes part of constructive notice. So if somebody else comes along later on, they see it in the chain of title. It's not just an agreement between the two owners that decide to get along with respect to each other, because that's not necessarily going to hold when a third party gets involved in that process.
Along that same boundary line adjustment, I just recorded a boundary line adjustment and it took me 15 and a half years. And the neighbors, like you said, still hate each other. And it all started over a freaking wall. But
That's
Yeah.
almost old enough to drive.
yeah, it was crazy. 15 and a half years to get a record of survey done.
Yeah, for house, yeah, when you think about what the scope of the problem is, it takes that long.
Yeah.
And how much money was involved in that process
yeah.
to get to that point.
At least $75,000 on each side. And the ultimate thing was like come down to, I think, 232 square feet.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Horrible.
really expensive real estate.
Horrible. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Did
Okay.
anybody else? Did you want to keep going? You got anything else? I was just going to open it up for questions if people got questions really quick.
No, that's it. There's a third case study, but I'll let that one go for now.
Yeah.
So Jerry?
Yeah.
I'm wishing you good luck on your third try. I'm doing my second try at retirement. And I'll tell you what, I'm enjoying the skiing. And I'm cleaning up a few messes that are still, projects never all go away. So there's always stuff that you have to clean up, but, and especially with water rights in Nevada. But I'm doing my best to stay the heck out of the office. And I'm looking forward to a little warmer weather where I get the motorcycle out and ride in the afternoon and still ski in the morning.
There you go. I love it.
Unfortunately, I keep getting drawn back in, so.
Yeah, that's a trap. That's a trap,
It
and
is.
it's easy to get caught in it.
It's because you guys
Well,
are so
yeah, see,
needed.
Yeah.
You guys'
it's like
knowledge is so needed.
Old surveyors never stop. They just keep meandering along, so.
Ba-dum-bum. I love it.
Yeah.
So I think in short, to summarize today, like everything in the land surveying profession, even down to ethics, can be defined as it depends.
You betcha. That's exactly what I told all my students all the time. Is it depends. You'll be surprised how handy that comes in when you're giving workshops and seminars.
Oh my gosh. Talk about
You know,
a
one
trap.
thing we didn't mention though was,
Go for it.
if you're unsure,
Yeah.
call somebody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great advice, David.
Call Trent, call George, call me.
Right?
Well,
Great.
and I-
Now, thanks, Dave. I'm retired.
And I think
Yeah,
that
but you can
goes-
still give out advice, right?
that what's really important in that respect is the mentorship that younger surveyors get when they come through the profession now, to
Yeah.
realize it's not just a technology thing. It's
Yeah.
not just who can measure stuff the quickest. It's like I told my students, doesn't matter how accurately you measure something, if it's a wrong thing, it's still wrong.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's that mentorship, because that's where your ethical model starts to get more sophisticated. When you start to interact with people that've got the broader knowledge base than you do,
Yeah.
and more world experience in that type of thing. So, yeah, it's extremely important in that respect. So, do your
was awesome.
jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. I love
Man,
it.
Trent, wouldn't that be an awesome thing if we had like a weekly thing with experienced people trying to just provide mentorship to
Oh,
Yeah.
young up and comers?
Imagine
Who would
that.
think of that? So
We should
Jerry,
look at that.
I gotta tell you, when I came out of retirement for the second time, I got a new
The
mentor.
problem is, I can't see a whole lot of the people here there, but it's not these guys here that need to be
Exactly.
talked to about this stuff. It's a lot of the younger ones that are
Yeah.
coming up that need to start to be looking at these types of things. Because like I
Right.
say, it's too easy to get caught up in that technology trap.
Yeah.
We've got quite a few up and comers on the webinar. It's just the old farts that are talking here.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm an old fart for sure.
Elbowing out all these young guys.
Me too. Me too, George.
So when I came out of retirement the second time 8 years ago, I got a new mentor, 20 years my junior, and I am in no way, shape, or form able to keep up with him.
That's awesome.
He's a ball of fire, and he knows what he's doing. He's good at it. He's thorough. He's efficient. I'm amazed at his patience with me. I really am.
Were we referring to Mr. Phillips?
No, well,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
talking about Ryan Cook.
Oh, yeah, cool. I love it.
But Greg's a good one too.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good. I love it. All right, boys and
Okay,
ladies.
if there are any more
ladies.
comments or
Thanks,
questions,
Jerry.
that's all I got.
No, we're good. Yeah. I appreciate the time. That was great.
Beaches down. I don't know if
Thanks,
that'll
great
work or not.
discussion.
Awesome. All right, guys.
Very interesting.
Thanks, Jerry.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Bye.
Where's my- Oh, I got stop screen share.
Yeah,
There
there we
we
go. I'll
go.
get it. There you go.